All right, this wraps up our coverage of World War II and just talking about the end of the war. You already have these down. Almost all of these we're going to talk about in some capacity, except for the Nuremberg trials. But the definition is pretty self-explanatory. But one of the things that the world has to come to terms with are all these atrocities that were committed, namely by the Nazis in Germany, but also there were atrocities committed by the Japanese on the Chinese and people of Southeast Asia, and they had their own trials as well. So I'm just going to say here, make sure you're taking these notes down. I'll give you 2 minutes to get a head start, and then I'll start explaining. Please do not pause the video.
I finished my quest.
Not right now.
Huh?
Not right now.
What is that?
Everyone, not right now.
Okay.
All right, so the end of World War II is sort of stamped by two big meetings, the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference. The key difference here is actually the changing of one individual. So leading up to the end of the war, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain try to get ahead of what's to come. Like when they realize, that they're pretty much, that they know they're going to win this. They don't know exactly the timeline, but they say, okay, well, we might as well go ahead and start planning for this. And this was with President Roosevelt for the United States. So the general concept is that the big three, as they were called, the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, meet in Yalta for this conference. And they lay out a plan of how Europe and Southeast Asia is going to be after the war. Like they got to figure out how to handle Germany without really like breaking up Germany and making it into several different countries. Really what they're trying to do is not repeat what happened at the end of World War I. So instead of punishing people, they want to make sure that the world emerges from this more peaceful than it ever had been. So they get together and they, make some of these decisions. One of the big things that we're going to talk about in the next chapter is Germany gets split into two, and its capital, Berlin, gets split into two, into an east and west for both of them, in which the United States and its allies will control the western half of both, and the Soviet Union controls the eastern half of both. That's sort of agreed upon during the Yalta Conference. But then President Roosevelt dies and President Truman steps in. And this changes the dynamic of a lot of different things. So at Potsdam, that conference, it's mainly between Truman and Stalin. And where Roosevelt was more of a diplomat, Truman, meaning that Roosevelt could get along with almost anybody. Truman was very strong-willed, very pig-headed. And in some cases that was a good thing, and like this case, it was not so well. And so immediately he butts heads with Stalin. They don't like each other. They publicly talk about how they don't like each other. And it sets the stage for what's going to happen after World War II and what we call the Cold War, in which President Truman makes it fairly known that he does not want communism or Soviet communism to spread around the world. And of course, that's what Stalin wants. He wants his style of government and his power to spread all over the world. So almost immediately, they're butting heads. And so Potsdam really sets up the sort of the attitude of what's going to happen internationally at the end of the war, whereas Yalta is more of the political side, saying, okay, this is who gets control of this, and this is how we're going to handle that. So at the very end of the war, of course, part of the reason it's called a world war is not just because the world was involved, but it also changes nearly everything on the planet Earth. So what you have is it marks the end of the old style monarchies that you have studied in world history, that we studied in reference to at the beginning of this course. Not that there's no longer kings and queens, but now there are democratic governments. So they usually, if there is a monarch, they have to answer to an elected group of representatives. Of course, anytime a war ends, there's going to be new borders drawn, and old countries were limited on their expansion. So case in point, Germany and Japan both were not allowed to have armies, literally up until the last 10, 15 years, present day. So that's what we mean by limited. Countries that were seen as causing problems were under heavy scrutiny and under a lot of restrictions through the United States, Soviet Union, and other allies. And again, we will talk about organizations that do that next chapter. And of course, the war marks the end of imperialism in the world. It caused too many problems. It was one of the things that created conflict that started World War I, and it was definitely something that started conflict in World War II. Countries wanting to get resources from other areas. So that's effectively stopped for the most part, at least in the way that we know it from back then. All right, last slide. There's a lot here, so get writing. And again, I'll give you 2 minutes, and then I'll start explaining. All right, so the biggest impact that's going to out of World War II that's going to affect the rest of our year learning is that the United States emerges as the dominant world power. So on top of things that we've kind of already talked about, like the United States, at least for a short period of time, is the only country to have nuclear weapons. But unlike after World War I, where the United States essentially just said, no, we're not going to deal with all these other issues. We're going to go back home, and we're going to become isolationists. The United States learns from this. But there's also a couple of other reasons why we become so dominant. The main reason is the United States was untouched by the war. Other than Pearl Harbor, there was no attacks, no battles, nothing happened on United States soil. So the United States was untouched. Europe, on the other hand, almost all of Europe had been bombed to rubble. So major cities, entire countries had to be rebuilt. They had to have roads rebuilt, bridges rebuilt, public buildings. Housing had to be rebuilt because a lot of it had been destroyed because of the war. And same thing goes in large areas of Southeast Asia and among the islands that were populated out in the Pacific. So whereas like the United States, we didn't have to rebuild anything. In fact, we made money off of rebuilding Europe, and we're going to get to that in the next chapter. So the United States is in this perfect position where now, because we don't have to deal with a lot of the after effects of the war, we can now take this position in which we can kind of dictate to the world how we want things to go. The Soviet Union is the other one that emerges, and that was mainly just out of pure willpower. They had a lot to rebuild, they had a lot to do, but they also had a larger area and more resources after the war than other European countries did. Now, the other thing that the United States doesn't back down from is now international cooperation. So again, after World War I, the United States becomes isolationist. They don't want anything to do with anything that is outside of North America, or at least outside of the Americas. So that's why the United States did not take part in the League of Nations. It was one of the reasons that the League of Nations failed. So at the very end of the war, while the war is still going on, the United Nations is created. And this is a place for countries to get together to promote peace. And the United States is backing it wholeheartedly this time. Not just like, hey, we'll participate. Instead, they're saying, we're not only going to participate, but we're going to be one of the main members and one of the main leaders in the United Nations. And it's part of the reason the United Nations is still in existence today, is because the United States decided to participate, and then as well, too, we were able to get all of our allies to join up, not just from the war, but over time we've been able to get them to join in. Now, while those are important, one of the most important things about World War II that impacts the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people in the United States, and eventually will set an example for other people around the world, is the World War II is the origin of liberation movements in the United States, or as you more commonly know, the civil rights movement, or what we refer to today as the modern civil rights movement, because civil rights have been going on ever since the foundation of the United States. But the key element here is much same as after World War I. After World War II, the United States, the people in power kind of expected everything to return to normal. So that everybody was going to go back home, everybody was going to, get a job, do this, do that, and everything will be fine. The problem with that mindset was the war offered opportunities to other marginalized groups of people. So we've talked about it in previous lessons. African Americans not only fought in World War II and fought valiantly, and were some of the African American regiments were some of the most awarded regiments in the war. So those people go over and they sacrifice their lives to defend freedom and liberty in Europe, and they're going to come back, and they're expected to come back home and go into Jim Crow South or into segregated neighborhoods, either out west or up north. They don't want to do that. They've given their full measure of devotion, so they expect to be treated equally when they come back. And again, it's not just African Americans that fought for the country, it's also African Americans who helped in the war effort, that took those factory jobs, that were producing the materials we needed to be successful. Same thing goes for women. Women stepped up during the war, in the war effort, and even too, some in the armed forces, even though they weren't allowed to fight. And the expectation after war was like, okay, now you can go back home, find a husband, raise a family. Well, a lot of women didn't want to do that. A lot of women didn't want to give up the rights and privileges that they had earned by earning them by work during the war. And the other groups that we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about, but that are going to bring things to light, are Asian Americans. Remember, particularly Japanese Americans were interred. They were put into prison during the length of the war. Japanese American children were in prison because people were afraid that they might be spies or secret agents of some sort. Latin Americans, by the hundreds of thousands, fought in the war. When they come back from the war, they are not going to want to just go back to being subservient to white people, or taking the low wages jobs that they were seemingly segregated into. And Native Americans fought bravely for the United States, helped with the war effort. They're not going to want to come back and just give up equality so that they can be stuck back on a reservation and denied their full American citizenship. And that's where we're going to leave it today.